on the theme of the conference, and you gave me the option to actually talk about other things as well, but I think it's better to actually talk about the topic of the conference. So it's on institutional design problems for consequentialism. As is well known, the so-called founding fathers of utilitarianism saw utilitarianism as a public philosophy, and in the sense that they saw themselves as reformers of the main social institutions of the society, and it's well known, for instance, that Bentham did a lot to reform the laws at the time in Britain. For some time, it was since 1971, I guess, Rawls and his many followers have actually, I think to some extent, dominated now the discussion of institutional design, the philosophy or the political philosophy of institutional design, and I think that's both fortunate and unfortunate. Fortunate because he actually moved on to focus on justice, which had been perhaps a neglected aspect of institutional design. Unfortunate because there are a lot of other aspects to be discussed. In fact, Rawls himself, in the introduction of the book, talks about other aspects of institution than justice, which he thinks are important social virtues. And I think it's now time for the consequentialists to some extent, to reclaim this discussion and put in well-being and overall intrinsic value on the scene. So that's what I'm trying to discuss today, or will discuss today. The relevance and importance of institution cannot be questioned, I think. We are all institutionalized. We live our lives through institutions, and in the sense that we are members, subjects, or office holders of a vast number of institutions. So you can be a mother in the familial institution, you can be a married person in the marital one, philosopher in a professional institution, a choir singer in the cultural, Buddhist, religious institution, a member of the Labour Party in the political institution, a subject of French law in the legal, and finally an owner of a car in the economic. Of course, there are other institutions as well, but here's a list of the sort of main institutions, social institutions. So it's important then, of course, that any moral theory should have something to say about this important fact that we are institutionalized and the importance of institutions in our lives. What is an institution then? Here, of course, there's quite a lot of discussion. So I'm going to give you just a thumbnail sketch of sort of some, at least, pretty commonly viewed conditions of what an institution is. So very abstractly viewed, it's at least the following. A set of rules, tasks, duties, and roles. And the task duties here define the roles, right? So, for instance, the task duties of a chair of a department will define the role of a chair of a department. Then we have a set of goals, which are supposed to be achieved by compliance with a set of rules, task duties, and roles. So you have cultural goals for the cultural institutions, educational goals for the educational institutions, and so on. And these goals can also actually involve the regulation of other institutions. So institutions can be sort of concerned with other institutions. So obviously governments, for instance, then regulate economic, educational, and often cultural institutions in the country. Some more optional features, or at least commonly seen as optional features. An institution can involve rules for how to change the rules. So it can be self-regulated institutions and rules for how to, procedures for how to change the rules of an institution. There can be rules for screening, in the sense of ruling out and ruling in people. For instance, there can be formal requirements when it comes to education to be able to be eligible for a certain office in an institution. There can be a set of negative sanctions for non-compliance, positive sanctions for compliance, and there can be different kinds of sanctions here, of course, related to different parts of the institution. And finally, which I think is quite important actually, the ethos of the institution, which is not perhaps captured by the formal rules for the task duties, But it's an important part of a well-functioning institution. So, for instance, the mutual trust in an institution, or let's say a shared vision, are important parts of institutions, and quite often are really crucial for successful achievement of the goals of the institution. So that was the institution very abstractly viewed. Then, of course, we have realized institutions, institutions that are actually existing in a society. And what is it for an institution to be realized? Well, there are discussions here too, of course, different views, but at least the following conditions. So it has to be embodied, this abstract institution, in the sense of having people occupying the roles, being the office holders and being the subjects, the customers. Which means, of course, the same abstract institution, seen as a set of rules and goals, can be embodied by different people at different times. And of course, different people with different talents, and different people who are differently suitable for the various offices as well. The second condition, being in force. It's also common to think that you can't have an institution realized without having a sufficient number of core members of this institution accepting the rules for the right reasons. So that is that an institution, realized institution, is not just a sort of a collective pattern of behavior, it's a norm-governed collective behavior, and that's then spelling out what norm-governed means. Of course, there are different views about how to spell it out exactly, but we don't have to go into that. Then, relatedly, to be a sincere office holder quite often requires being willing to justify institutional decisions by invoking some reasons and not invoking others. So, for instance, if I'm a teacher, I cannot be a sincere teacher and justify my marking decisions only in terms of what pleases the student, even though the students might want that. That wouldn't be actually being a teacher in this sense. So what is my focus now for this talk? Well, I'm focusing on two very foundational questions, so I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of specific institutions. I'm just thinking about the very general normative questions. So the first one I call the design question. How should we design institutions? And the second I call the compliance question. Which institutions should we comply with? And when I talk about designing here, I'm thinking about creating institutions, but also maintaining institutions and reforming institutions. Because quite often, of course, we're not starting from scratch and create institutions. We are already participating in a number of institutions. So what we can do is to maintain, change, reform, and not just create completely new institutions. For simplicity, I'm going to refer to all these different kinds of design actions as creating an institution, creating the realization of an institution. And the question is how to design systems of institutions, since institutions interact in important ways, and if you just focus on one institution and try to sort of make things as good as possible for that one, you might make things really worse, so really overhaul and sacrifice other important institutions. So the idea is to think about the design of a system of interacting institutions. And of course, I'm assuming a consequentialist perspective. This is, after all, the conference of the utilitarians. And also for simplicity, assuming that we're talking about the value of actual consequences rather than the value of probable consequences, but it won't affect the arguments, I think. So, two very tempting answers then to these two questions. One is to the first question, that we ought to create the best institutions. The second question, we ought to follow the rules of the best institutions. That might sound like a triviality, but I'm actually going to argue against those answers and claim that they're actually not plausible, under a certain number of very natural interpretations of what best means here. And I'm going to suggest some alternative and what I think more plausible answers to these questions. And the main aim, I guess, is to sort of reformulate the debate and argue that this is not the best way to approach the issues. We shouldn't think about what's best and worst when it comes to institutions. we should think in a different way. I'm going to let you wait to see that. In fact, I'm going to also show that these two answers actually lead to design problems for consequentialism itself. So in order to make sense of these or make them more precise, you will see that you get into quite complicated problems of how to design the theory of consequentialism. And I'm going to show a way to avoid those design problems. The first tempting answer then was that we ought to create the best institution, and of course one reason for that might be you think that we ought to choose the best, right? And here the best is we talk about institutions, so the best institution should be chosen. Who are we? So I'm assuming, of course, that we think about agents that can create the institutions, so politicians, policymakers, legislators, office holders, and so on. And it can either be collective or individual agents. I'm not ruling out that collective agents can have responsibilities and duties. The best, then, of course, is supposed to be best from a set of institutions. And of course, the idea is that the best is relative to what we can create. So we look at the set of institutions we can create and look at the best. And of course, that's pretty empty until we know what kind of value we are talking about. So here I'm going to give you 4 natural interpretations of that value, which we define best in terms of. The first one is achievement value, the second is goal value, the third one, compliance value, and finally, the last one, acceptance value. And I should say, as a qualification, that for all these accounts, on the basis sort of what we ought to do on the basis of these values, they need also to add that transitional costs should be not ignored. For the obvious reason that it can be very difficult to embody an institution, to find the right people for the right offices, and it can be very difficult and very costly for members to internalize the crucial rules, and these costs should be taken into account when we think about which institution to create. So we need to somehow weigh the transitional costs against the value of the institution, and I'm going to implicitly assume that that's done all through the discussion. So the first view then, the achievement value account, says that we want to create institutions with the highest achievement value. Remember that I defined institutions as having goals and having rules that are supposed to be instrumental to achieving the goals. Then, of course, we can talk about the achievement value in the sense of the degree to which the rules of the institution serve its goals. So the first account then says that we want to create an institution with the highest achievement value, and the achievement value is defined in the way I just described. What about this? Well, it's of course true that we want educational institutions to serve educational goals and political ones to serve political goals and so on. But of course, institutions can have a very high achievement value and still have very bad goals. Right? So, famous examples can be very well organized systems of slavery, Nazi law, or caste systems, or apartheid systems. And obviously, just because they have very high achievement value, we should not create these institutions. So, alternative view would be to look at the value, the intrinsic value, of the goals that are partly defining the institutions. So we want to create the institution for the overall most valuable goals. And here the goal value of an institution is the aggregated value of the goals of the institution, because it can be more than one for some institutions at least. And that will take care of the objection we just discussed, because institutions with bad goals, such as slavery, ought not to be created according to this account. But of course this is not sufficient either, right? Because you can have an institution with very good goals, but it's very poorly organized in the sense that the rules actually do not serve the goals. And therefore it would be stupid to create such an institution. So we need a revision here. So the value of the institution should be then a function of the value of the goals and the degree to which the rules comply with the goals. But then, of course, we have a non-compliance problem, because institutions with good goals and that are well organized might be such that they would not be complied with if you created them. So you can think about Institutions for angels, right? Fantastic goals, well organized, but it's not made for human society. So because and people wouldn't in fact comply with them, these rules at all. So that's not a good account either. Another problem is that there are some effects that should be taken into account when you create institutions that are not related to the value of the goals. Right? You can have these non-institutional effects. For instance, you can have cases where falling in love is not regulated by institutions, typically, at least. So it's not the sort of explicit goal of an institution to regulate falling in love. But of course, institutions can have as a side effect various major effects on these emotions and when they take place by traffic regulations or communication systems which enable people to meet. And this will in turn create then perhaps new people, so their future will look differently because you enable people to fall in love and to have kids and so on. And those are all important non-institutional effects that we should take into account. Haven't though so far, I should add, but we should. Population ethics still needs to be taught to politicians and policymakers, I think. So whether one should create an institution should also then depend on such non-institutional effects, and it's not covered then, captured by this particular account. So another one, the third one then, would be the compliance value account. So we want to create the institutions with the highest compliance value, and the compliance value of an institution is just the overall value of the outcomes of universal compliance with the rules of the institutions. And this will of course then take into account the value of the goals achieved by universal compliance and the value of other non-institutional effects. We're looking about what would happen if everyone followed the rules, including non-institutional effects. And of course we all aware of a problem with this kind of account, namely the problem of non-compliance. So if we assess institutional rules only on the basis of how well they perform under full compliance, we totally ignore how they would deal with partial non-compliance, and of course that's the usual case. And, in fact, Rawls himself just defined a way that in the first chapter of his book, he just talked about full compliance, assumed full compliance. So we need somehow then to be able to take into account partial compliance. And one idea is then to think about not what would happen if everyone followed the rules, but what would happen if a certain percentage, n, followed the rules. But what percentage? Of course, that's the tricky one, right? Brad Hooker has one answer. You might not be convinced that that's exactly the right answer. And it might be a question about how can you choose an n that's not arbitrary here? And I guess more importantly, why should we create an institution if we know that it will not be complied with, even if its compliance value is very high for a certain chosen n? You can still think that, well, you should look at what will actually happen if you create an institution, not what would happen if a certain percentage n followed the rules, because you might know that that percentage n is not actually what will happen. There's another percentage that will be the compliance percentage. The second problem here has to do with how to define outcomes. So it's actually been ignored, this problem, for some time. That you, in some cases, have a hard time defining the value of universal compliance, because it's very difficult to understand what the outcome, the unique outcome is of full compliance. So here are some reasons why it's difficult to have a well-defined notion of outcome. Because some rules can be vague, can be indeterminate, what they prescribe. They can be gappy, be silent on certain issues, they shouldn't be silent. They can be inconsistent, not explicitly of course, but implicitly, like EU law and national law. It's overlapping jurisdictions. They can be permissive, provide a range of permissible compliance options, and they can have different outcomes for different combinations of performances of permissive compliances. And finally, they can be sensitive to actions of customers and subjects, by customers appealing or subjects applying or complaining, and that, of course, is part of the consequences that should be taken into account. But full compliance then doesn't say anything about these external sort of forces, pressures. Then, even if you sort of think that you should sort these things out by only focusing on precise, non-gappy, determinate, consistent rules that are not sensitive to customers' pressures and so on, there's still a problem. And this is a problem that's discussed early, 66, 67, how it's solvable. Donald Regan, in his 80s book about corporation utilitarianism, took it up. Holly Smith was also talking about it in the 70s. But then, for a long time, it was complete ignorance, silence about this. It just disappeared from the radar. And in fact, in many books, in Brad Hooker's book, it's not discussed at all. And in other articles too, it's not really taken into account. That is that we have, for normal institutions at least, we have conditional rules. Rules that tells you what to do when other people act in a certain way. Also how to react to others' behaviors. And that's a very common feature. So here's a very silly toy example with two conditional rules, two act types and two persons. So you have these two institutional rules. Do A if the other person does B. Do B if the other person does A. And of course then you have two universal compliance, not one unique, right? One is that I do A, you do B. The other is you do A, I do B. You have two universal compliance and need not have the same value. And this is shown by this example. The ambulance case, you have an accident, let's say, and you have two hospitals close to this accident, equally close perhaps. And the institutional rules we imagine would be that send the ambulance if the other person does not. Do not send the ambulance if the other person does, because you shouldn't waste ambulance staff going to the same accident when you need only one ambulance for this accident. Then of course you do have two universal compliances. I send the ambulance, you do not. You send the ambulance, I do not. And these two universal compliances need not have the same value, since, for instance, my ambulance staff might happen to be more skilled, and therefore save more lives, let's say. So they had that case where universal compliance is not unique, so we can't talk about the universal compliance. One move made often when it comes to at least the vague and other kind of problems with institutions, to think about acceptance value instead of compliance value. So we want to create institutions that have the highest acceptance value, and that's defined as the value of the outcome of general acceptance of the rules of the institution. And the virtue here, of course, is that you can then have, you have a well-defined notion of the consequence of people accepting vague, gappy, inconsistent, permissive, customer-sensitive rules. Right? There is an outcome of that. People will do something and react to it in certain ways. Not so clear, perhaps, that we can handle conditional rules, at least if there are cases where acceptance implies compliance. That's something Holly Smith discussed in a recent number of the issue of utilitas. The problem, of course, with this kind of account has one problem is analogous to the the compliance account, namely the problem of non-acceptance. So if we assess institutional rules only on the basis of how well they perform under full acceptance, we totally ignore how they would deal with partial non-acceptance, which typically means non-compliance. And to the same kind of reply, you can sort of think about less than full acceptance, but what kind of a percentage n of acceptance? And why should we, for a certain particular n, create the institution if we know that it will not, in fact, be accepted? So it's a very similar problem. A problem that hasn't been discussed much is the embedding problem. And Shelley Kagan, I think, is the first one to really make this point. He just pointed it out, he didn't do so much with it. I'm trying to extend a little bit here. So the idea, of course, is that rules don't have consequences. They are abstract. But you have to sort of somehow psychologically embed them by some kind of acceptance to talk about the outcome of these rules. So it's the outcome of the acceptance, the psychological embedding of the rule that will have an outcome, not the rule itself. But what kind of acceptance? So here it's quite a large number of options, right? It can be a mere normative judgment, or a judgment formed in a certain way, perhaps on basis of good evidence, perhaps judgment plus motivation or a certain strength, plus disposition to praise and blame to some degrees, plus disposition to feel guilt and remorse to some degrees. And we have a plethora of options here. And the question is, which one should we choose? We talk about the acceptance value of a rule. And of course, we can get different outcomes with different values for different assumptions about the nature of the relevant kind of attitude, obviously, because if we vary the strength of the motivation or the strength of the praise and blame dispositions, we'll quite often get different values of the outcomes. So, what to do? Well, I suggest then, after this very short discussion, of course there are various ways to answer these objections. Some of them might lead you outside consequentialism, and some might become very complicated indeed. There are some attempts of that sort, but I don't have time to discuss those details here. But I suggest rather that we should reformulate the problem here and not ask which institutions are best or how do we realize them. We should instead ask which of our feasible design actions would have the best consequences. And of course, design action again is either creating, maintaining, or reforming a certain realization of an institution. Because you don't just create an abstract entity, you create a certain realization of certain people fulfilling certain offices with a certain ethos, with a certain degree of internalization. That's what we should focus on. That kind of more concrete direct act focused question. So we have then what I call the direct account for designers. One ought to perform a design action just in case its outcome is better than that of any of one's alternative actions. And here, of course, the outcomes of design actions are well defined. It's just the same as outcomes of any old action, just happen to be design actions. And this direct account will take into account institutional and non-institutional effects, sensitive to non-compliance and non-acceptance, would think about what would actually happen if we created this institution. How many would comply? How many would accept? What would the value of that be? And it will, of course, take into account transitional costs. Right? That's one of the values that will determine whether design action is permissible or not. And we don't have an embedding problem. We just have this design action, which is a feasible one, and we ask ourselves what would happen if that design action were performed. We don't have to do any further embedding of any rules. So we evade then the sort of internal structural design problems for the other more indirect accounts. So that's my first bit about the design question, and then we'll move on to the compliance question. Which institutions ought we to follow? And as I said, one tempting answer was that one ought to follow the rules of the best institutions. And of course, given the discussion of what best means here, we have four distinct views to discuss. One is that we follow institutions with the highest achievement value, or the ones whose goals have the overall highest value, or the one with the highest compliance value, or finally the one with the highest acceptance value. These are the distinct proposals. Three general problems here. First one, best, better than what? What is the relevant set of alternative institutions here? It does talk about better and best institutions. We haven't said anything about whether one is particular agents' options. So the reply, I guess, which is quite a vague reply, is to say that it's somehow the ones realizable in the relevant society. That can be made precise in different ways, but that's, I guess, one way to go. One issue then is that no matter how you make that vague proposal precise, it looks like you rarely have an obligation to follow existing institutions, because I guess it's pretty unlikely that realized existing institutions are the best in this sense, right, of the realizable ones. So it's unlikely that we ought to follow the rules. And that seems to be not a great answer to the compliance question. Because intuitively, I think, a lot of people would say that we quite often have ought to follow the existing rules. A third problem then is what to do when we have the best institution is something that's not in fact realized, or to follow the best institution when they are not realized. That's problematic because, first of all, often we can't follow the institutions when they're not realized, because some of the actions that would be seen as following the institutions are constituted by the institutional rules. Let's say signing a legally binding contract, marrying a person, or perhaps even making a promise. You can't do those, perform those actions, unless there is an institution in place. So if there is none, then you can't perform them. And even if you can't follow them, the consequences of compliance can be very bad when the institutions is not in place or realized. So you can think about rescue missions, when if the institution had been in place, and each of us had played our part in that institution, the consequence would be very good, but in fact the institution is not in place, and here I am following the rules of the institution and just causing a very bad outcome. And finally, it inherits some of these accounts, the previous problems. I don't think we want to say that we should follow the rules of the institution with the highest achievement value, for similar reasons we discussed before, or whose goals have the overall highest value, again for the same reasons. And when it comes to following the rules of the highest compliance, the institution with the highest compliance value, we still have the non-compliance problem to solve, and also the outcome problem, how to define the outcomes of these various alternative institutions we're comparing. And for the acceptance value account, we have the non-acceptance problem and the embedding problem. What kind of acceptance are we supposed to think about here when we define the outcomes of the universal or the n percentage acceptance of the rules? Another problem here, which is not discussed before actually, which is more unique to this particular question, is the uniqueness problem. What if there is no unique institution with the highest compliance value or acceptance value? Are we permitted to follow either? Well, that's problematic. It can lead to really bad outcomes, because it can lead to driving on the left and driving on the right, assuming that these two institutional rules, driving on the left, one hand, driving on the right, and the hand, are equally good. Are we only permitted to do what's allowed by all optimal institutions? That seems to be too restrictive. It might be few, if any, remaining options. So that's the problem. A way to perhaps address some of these problems is something that's been discussed by Robert Gooden and Attila Tani, and also Vuko Andrić. I think Vuko and Attila both are here. So, not sure this is exactly what they have in mind, so we'll have to discuss that in the discussion period. But this is two interpretations I'm going to discuss of their views. The important point here is that you distinguish between two different agents, right? So you have these public decision makers on one hand, and then you have the subjects on the other. And the public decision makers should adopt the direct account for designers I just presented. So they want to perform the design action that has better consequence than any alternative action. But the subjects ought to follow the rules of the institution that the public decision maker ought to create. So they're different than duties depending on what kind of agent they are. An obvious problem with this formulation, which again I'm not saying that it's Atlas or Bob Gooden's view or Buka's view, is that if the public decision maker fails to create the institutions she ought to create, then it seems to be, in many cases, very stupid to still follow these rules. So you're back to the problems of following the rules of non-realized institutions. Sometimes you can't follow them because their actions are constituted by the rules. When we can, the consequence can be very bad, as in the rescue mission. So same problem here. A new version, or better version of the division of labor account, would say that public decision makers ought to perform this design action that has better consequences than that of an alternative action, same as before. And others, the subjects, ought to follow the rules of the institutions that the public decision maker ought to create and has in fact created. So that's avoiding the problem of failing decision makers, in that sense. Avoiding the problem, of course, creating a new one, because then it's incomplete, right? Because we need to know what to do when the public decision maker does not create the institution she ought to create. We still have need an answer to that. And that is a serious problem, of course, since it's very common that public decision makers err in the decisions to create institutions. They don't always create the best, or they don't always perform the best design actions. We know that. It's quite common. We have recent examples. Possibly. And finally, it can still have bad consequences to follow the rules of the institution that the public decision makers has rightly created. And here's a very abstract example of this. So the idea is that you have a designer, we call him the designer of the institutions, can choose between realizing institution A or realizing institution B. If B is realized, you get a very bad outcome, perhaps because there are a lot of non-compliance. If institution A is realized, you get the black line there, going all the way up to a bad outcome. And that's what would happen if the institution A were to be realized. Suppose the designer realizes institution A, which you ought to do, right? Because bad is better than very bad. It does not seem sensible for Pn minus 1, the one before Pn here, to comply, since Pn would then fail to comply, and that would be bad rather than very good. So Pn minus 1 should go down there, not comply, to get the very good outcome. And of course, you can make this extremely, you can have very huge difference between very good and bad. And so it doesn't have to be just a small difference. You can make it as big as you want. So I think it's still problematic to comply with designer's right choice of institutions. It's still a bit troublesome. A problem for both versions, perhaps not a great problem, at least it's an issue at least, that they seem to provide disjointed explanations of rightness. So different right makers for different agents, one for public decision makers, one for subjects. They might want, why should only the public decision makers maximize value? Why shouldn't the subjects also do that if we are really consequentialists? Now, I've been sort of bashing then the division of labor account. I do think there's something true about this, and that might be perhaps closer to what Atle and Bob are arguing, namely that we should really think hard about the designer's abilities here. They have powers that normal subjects do not. They have powers to then design the institutions by setting up the right rules and sanctions and embodying the institutions with the right people and with the right dispositions that can enable the members of the institutions to cooperate and bring about value, a lot of value. And that, of course, can be seen as one of the raison d'etre of actually having institutions, in fact, at least for a consequentialist perspective, that they do provide us with a way to cooperate in the joint promotion of value and to coordinate our actions in that sense. So what I'm suggesting then is sort of a general direct account, namely that one ought to perform an institution-related action, whether it's a design action, compliance action, non-compliance action, just in case its consequences are better than that of an alternative action, because I guess act consequentially is true, I claim. Right. So, I mean, you might be suspecting all along that this is what's coming, and here it is. Yeah, I am, in fact, an act consequentialist. The obvious challenge here, of course, is that a lot of people think that act consequentialism gives too little reason to comply with institutions. You only comply with institutional rules when the compliance happens to maximize overall value. That's not enough, a lot of people would argue. Should remember here that even the indirect accounts I just discussed seem to have problems with the so-called compliance question, because rarely are the best rules in fact in place. Right? So it's not like act consequentialism is the only figure for this kind of issue, how to meet this challenge. An important clarification when it comes to this challenge is that it's not a challenge about how to explain why we should not think in terms of maximizing overall value when acting in institutional settings. So thinking in terms of maximization of value will often, of course, have bad consequences. Just think about the time it takes to calculate the overall value of the consequences. And of course, as I said before, it can also be inconsistent with actually being a sincere office holder. Right? If you think in terms of maximizing overall value for every individual in the world, when you're making decisions, hiring decisions for a department or marking decisions for your students, you're not any longer playing the game. You're not a sincere office holder of that particular institution. So what one needs then is what Petit and Brennan had suggested, some kind of red light disposition. You need to be disposed not to comply when too much is at stake, but not look out for that. Because if you're looking out for that, again, you can't actually play your role. It has to be a pretty brute disposition at that. And there's much more to say about that, but I don't have time. But this is what, something like that is what is needed. But the problem and the challenge is not about the thinking part, it's about the intuitive notion that actually we think we ought, in many cases, to comply with the existing institutions. Now, some tentative answers to the obvious challenge, and that will be the last bit of the talk. Of course, sometimes it's actually unproblematic to not comply. Sometimes you ought to not comply, namely, you should avoid something really, really bad. And that can be either in terms of institutional goals or other values. I think about whistleblowing and conscientious objection. Those things can be justified overall, these actions. Sometimes the institution needs to be reformed, so one ought to work towards reforming the institution and not just fail to conform with it. It's not like you can just, okay, I'm not conforming with the institution and then walk away. No, you have a duty to actually try to reform the institution so it performs better. And finally, sometimes you can actually avoid the conflict by permissibly resigning your office and then evade the task duty that would have been in conflict with maximizing overall value. You can sometimes foresee that there will be a conflict and that you can permissibly exit the institution and then act according to consequentialism and not actually violate the institutional rules either. Here's something for the non-utilitarian consequentialists in the audience. The others will not be happy. And I'm sort of half-heartedly inclined to accept some of this, actually. So the one view would say that compliance actually is important because some actions constituted by the institutional rules can have final intrinsic value. Getting married, adopting a child, giving to charities, giving someone a fair trial, or perhaps better examples, could be seen as something that in itself has value, and by your action of compliance, you will actually add this final value to the world. So compliance has this extra plus, so to speak, not just in terms of causal effects, but in itself has final value. Or as Chris Woodard and others have been, especially Chris Woodard, have been arguing, participating in joint venture for some good goals can also be seen as having final value. Of course, under certain conditions, not when you know that no one else will do anything. That's the rescue mission problem. But if you know that enough will play their part, and yet another instance of participating in a joint venture for some very important good can itself have final value, even though it doesn't perhaps affect much the effects of the actions. But itself has final value to be participating with the right kind of intentions in this joint venture. I'm open to that kind of two ideas, because I'm myself not a utilitarian. So, concluding remarks. So my defense of this general direct account has been tentative, of course, and needs to be elaborated on much more. I have a few more things to say, maybe in the discussion, to defend myself. But I still think that a direct account, on the basis of what I just said, you can see that it has, I think, something going for it, perhaps more going for it, in the sense that its right makers are simple, unified, the same for all agents. It has well-defined outcomes. There is no outcome problem or embedding problem. There's no uniqueness problem about what to do when we have two optimal institutions, which one to follow. There's no compliance and non-acceptance problem of the kind we just discussed. You look at the design actions and think about what would actually happen if this institution were created. How many would comply? How many would accept? And what would the value be of that? And it takes into account transitional costs, namely how to reach what happens when we create the institution, how much transitional cost would that involve, and then we have to weigh that against other effects. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Krister, for this great presentation. We now have time for questions.
Connor Johnson published a book at the beginning of the 1990s, Moral Legislation, which I think perhaps because he died soon afterward has never become as well known as I believe it should be. And Johnson makes some arguments which I think have affinities with the sort of account you've laid out here. He suggests that when you have institutions in place that are promoting better outcomes than if everybody sought to maximize individually, like ACT consequentialists, then there's a prima facie reason to abide by those institutions. When actually it would work better if everybody were not to comply with that institution and maximize individually, then you are under no obligation to do so, avoiding the sort of obligation to comply with suboptimal institutions. Finally, he says that there is a role for sort of moral entrepreneurship. Under circumstances, there's a prima facie reason to abide by existing institutions that are better than, that promote better outcomes than individual maximizing. But if you see an opportunity to bring about an institution that's even a lot better, you can, under some circumstances, challenge and defy the rules and seek to bring about a new one. So I'm wondering if you're familiar with this account and whether you find that sort of a plausible sort of set of approach to the question.
So, no, I'm not familiar with that account. And in fact, the whole topic is something sort of new to me, except I know some parts of it from other discussions, but the institutional design problems is a new topic for me. So that's very helpful, thank you. I'm not exactly sure what the proposal was again. So you said it's some prima facie reason to comply with existing rules. And what's the reason for that?
If the rules are bringing about a better outcome that would be achieved by individual maximums, sort of the same criterion that Ryan used in the utilitarianism thoughts, saying if you're going to do better collectively speaking, but if enough people are complying with an existing set of rules, that the outcome is better than if everybody individually maximizes, then you have a prima facie obligation to abide by them. But if not. So you aren't obliged to abide by, say, slavery or something like that, because it would be actually better if everybody went out and sought to maximize utility or value, however we define it correctly, rather than complying with the rules of the slavery institution.
So the idea is that you look at the consequences of full compliance or full acceptance, and if that's better than the consequence of each person acting according to ACT consequentialism.
No actual levels of compliance, whether enough people are actually
complying
with the existing institution. Yeah.
Actual compliance, and that's supposed to be better than what would happen if they were each individually acting according to ACT consequentialism.
Right.
Then they should follow the rules.
If and only if that is the case, yes.
Right. So actually, here might be time for my extra slide. So the compliance question for ACT consequentialism. As I see it, the designers, when it comes to institutions here, they have a key role to play. That's why I think it's something true with the division of labor account, right? That they can, by putting into place the right rules, the right sanctions, make sure that people have dispositions to coordinate in the production of a good. So here's a case: we have 3 agents, one here, one there, and one finally here, and they have compliance and non-compliance options, each of them. And you need 3 compliances to get the good, let's say 10. And if you have less than 3, 0. The good is not corrected. So the designer has in his power, with the right material, so to speak, of people and rules and sanctions, to try to make sure that we get the 3 C's. Right? Of course, that doesn't always work. But if the designer has these elements and can combine the right way, they can at least make it likely that people, in fact, will, in the institutional setting, in each case, comply. Right? The question, of course, is then, will they individually act rightly according to ACT consequentialism or not? That's sometimes an issue, right? And in this case, if you think about the options here, it looks like, well, the first person here is choosing between this one, and here, of course, only zeros here. Let's say, in fact, 10 will be produced if this first option is chosen. That's why you have a black line there. So that person is acting correctly. The second one is choosing between some 0 here and 10 ought to comply, so that's according to Act Consequentialism 2. And finally, the third person has choosing between 10 and 0, and complying is also according to Act Consequentialism. So this case is a case where, let's say, the decider foresaw this, right, and created this institution with these kind of dispositions so that people will actually act according in this way, and also it's actually consistent with each of them acting rightly according to Act Consequentialism. This is the case. But of course, this is not always the case. And in fact, when you have a case like this, you see that you can have each individual non-complying, and it's permissible according to Act Consequentialism. So this person is first going down, and that will make sure you get 0 at the end. Or it could have gone up, but that would be the 0 again, it would be the same, so permissible for the first one to go down. The second person is also permissible to go down, because had it gone up, it would be 0, and the 0 there, so permitted. And finally, the third person is also permitted to do what she is doing, because it's 0 there. So here's a case where each person is acting rightly or permissibly according to Act Consequentialism, but not producing the good, right? And this is, I think, a sort of objection, right? And something that the account you're discussing is supposed to solve, right? What would the Act Consequentialists say about this? Well, one issue here is, of course, that they can... I'm talking about sort of three agents here. They could, of course, be the same agent. Right? It could have been the same agent acting at 3 times. And if it is, then it actually depends on how you define alternative actions. Right? So if you define alternative actions as just these sort of minimal actions, sort of immediately performable, then you get the fact that the agent, same agent at each time is acting permissibly, and you end up here. If you go for a more maximalist account of permissible actions, you do actually get the result that the agent is acting impermissibly, because the relevant actions now are not the small bits here, but the whole branches, right? So the agent could do C, 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 or C, C, not C, and so on. And by going down here, the person performed this sequence of actions, which is one performable action, where they could have performed a much better action. So that's the case where the Act Consequentialist could, by invoking a more, I think, plausible idea about alternative actions, say that in fact the person is acting wrongly according to Act Consequentialism. So it's quite important when you discuss Act Consequentialism that you have a particular view of the alternative actions involved. And this would be a case where that's important. If there are different people here, so we have perhaps one person here, another person at the third point, and the second person here. So same person at one, first one and third one, is different one here. Then it depends, right? Because it might be that someone here, the alternative action should be defined in terms of plans. So the first person's options is sort of conditional plans, namely doing C, and if the other person does something, do something else, right? And then in this particular case, this person is going down, would go down, no matter what he did. So in fact, he can't choose anything, right? So the person here is preventing C to reach 10, which he could have done, right? So, but that I think is in favor of Act Consequentialism. I mean, it's nothing this person can do to change the behavior of this person. He will fail to comply no matter what the C is doing. That's just what it is. And then I think it's nothing you can do about it. So it's not a problem, I think, for Act Consequentialism in this case. Because the first agent here has no chance of reaching up there, because the second agent is going down, and would go down no matter what. So I think the precise sort of virtues and vices of Act Consequentialism depends on which kind of examples you have in mind. And I think in many cases, not all, I should add, Act Consequentialism is not, I think, a defective theory, because it's very sensitive, of course, to other people's non-compliance in these cases. And I think that's a virtue.
Other questions?
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
In one of your first slides, you were talking about feasible design action, and so I wanted to ask you to sort of tell us a bit more about this feasibility, because of course, I mean, the assessment of a feasibility on institution, it seems to me a very political thing. I mean, you ask Russian people before the Bolshevik Revolution whether it is feasible to think about communism, and they would say, no, of course no. You ask all these people in classic Greek whether it is possible to create a Greek state, and they would say, no, it's impossible. So, I mean, what is this feasible thing here? Because it's a bit intriguing.
Good question. So this is then, you could perhaps see it as sort of, I still have a problem. I don't have the embedding problem, because I don't have to ask myself, I don't have to think about how to embed a rule to get the relevant consequences. But I do need to think about what a feasible action is. That's true. But of course, the person who goes for the rule-focused view would have two problems. Namely, first define the feasible rules, and then also then define the right kind of embedding. So they have two problems. I have one. so far, I think I'm relatively okay. But you're right. I mean, how to define feasible design actions, I think, is a crucial question. In fact, I think it's just the general question about how to define a feasible action relevant for normative assessment or moral assessment. And there are, of course, various accounts of how to do that. Some of them are in terms of just mere objective features, namely there are some actions, act types here, such that the person can intend them, and if they were to intend them, certain consequences would ensure, but they might not be aware of those act types, right? So that's an objective account. Some accounts are more psychological, so they think about the agent's sort of beliefs, perhaps could be at least could be known by the agent to be an action which would have certain consequences. So they hold a variety of answers to that tricky question, and I think it has to be answered. But I think that's sort of a general question for any account that talks about the rightness or rationality of a feasible action. You need an account of what feasible means. So I don't have one to give you right now, but I think it's a good question. But as I said, if you go for the rules, then you have to have the notion of feasible rules, and the embedding problems, and the uniqueness problems. So you have more problems in that account.
It's my turn. Does it work? Yeah. So the division of labor thing. Well, you said a lot there, Krister, so you surprised me with that. There was one slide on criterion rightness, was it, or something like that?
Yeah.
I mean, well, I don't know if this is really a response, but the idea we have is that the idea is not that there is, say, two different kinds of moral value or whatever, and there are two different kinds of principles to promote those values. But more like we have the usual impartial perspective, but the best way to promote that kind of value is to have different sets of principles, or two kinds of principles. So I think it's similar to what Sam Scheffler has this distinction between institutional division of labor and moral division of labor. So we're not going for moral division of labor. Our idea is only that there are decent, pretty good reasons to have an institutional division of labor, and these reasons are also compatible with consequentialist reasoning. But I guess, strictly speaking, yeah, we kind of bifurcate the criterion of rightness nonetheless. I mean, of course, since you have two principles, yeah, I mean, according to the different principle, you have different kinds of different understanding of rightness, but I'm not sure that that's such a big problem in itself if you have really good reasons to have institutions and to therefore just require people to set up and maintain those institutions, but not on the basis of say, moral values, that would be different, you know? So the moral division of labor approach would be something like we have agent relative values, and we need one set of principles to promote those values, and we have agent neutral values, we need one set of principles to promote those. Institutions do the latter, individuals do the former. We're not going for that. So I mean, it's not a full answer to you, but that's the kind of thinking. Yeah. As for the rest, it's hard to answer because it's a lot and it's new to me. But it has to be said that all kind of thinking is motivated by demandingness considerations, which obviously don't know whether we really diffuse, but we had discussion about this in the morning. But of course I would put this against you, but I'm pretty sure that you are not particularly troubled by demandingness considerations. Of course I would say our account has the advantage of dealing better with demandingness problems than yours. It's no real answer to the other detailed slides you have, but that's why we haven't thought about those kinds of problems. Yeah? So that's another remark. And the third remark is that we are much better with fighting the Rawlsians because we actually hijacked their idea of division of labor, right? So how much better is that?
Thank you, that's very helpful. Yeah, so you're perfectly right, of course, I'm not actually discussing the demanding objection, and that's both for good, I guess, to some extent, and especially for you and Wuko, the motivation for going for the division of labor account. So what I'm focusing on here is just the more foundational issues of how to formulate the account, right? So one formulation was in terms of following the rules that the decision maker, the public decision maker, ought to create, but then of course they don't create what they ought to create, and then you have an problem if you try to follow those rules. Of course, it can lead to really bad outcomes.
Yeah, well, I haven't thought of that, so that's
and the second, of course, if you think about following the rules that are, in fact, they have created, or the institutions they have created, then you need an account still for the case where they err. Well, that's very common. So. But, of course, my account, the consequentialist account, maximizing at that, of course, will have issues and problems with demandingness, which I have discussed and will not have time to address here. The other points about are you or are you not providing us with disjointed explanation of rightness? If I looked at Bob Gooden's book about this kind of stuff, and it's very actually unclear in his discussion. He puts it in a footnote that he's so perhaps saying that ultimately justification is actually act consequentialist. So it's not taking a stand actually in that account. And of course I'm not denying that when it comes to decision methods, there is a division of labor which is more than I've just endorsed here. Never that we should think in different ways depending on which role we're playing in the institution. And of course Bob Gooden is talking a lot about that that seems to be fine because then it's fine to be impartial if you're a public decision maker, but it's not so fine to be explicitly, intentionally, consciously impartial in family decisions, right? Impartial in the sense you think about the neighbors' children as much as you think about your own kids. But he's not actually taking a proper stand on that, so it's still... so I have no problems with the idea that you have different decision methods for different people in different roles.
Would you put the slide of your answer, the final answer to your design question? The slide which contains your final answer to the design question.
Let's see. Perhaps it's further down.
Okay. The one. The one before this one. That's all.
Oh, sorry, not the generals, just the answer to which was the... Yeah, I understand.
Okay. So I'm two concerns about this thing. First one is that I'm not sure whether design action is well-defined notion. It includes, I think, creation and maintenance, and reform, I don't know. But there seems to be different ways of creating and maintaining and maintenance. And so depending on the ways of creating and maintaining, I think they have different values. And so they might not have definite value on it. That's one concern. Second concern is that, that perhaps the designer might not go through with the design action from the start to the ending. That is, they might starting creating the best possible plan or institution if it is completed through the end of maintenance. But perhaps as a Japanese government, they have lack of will to go through with the so that one, or some other reason. They started, but they failed to create whole thing, or they create a whole thing, but they fail to maintain it, or something. In that case, so the first action might have disastrous consequences. So that's the kind of compliance problems you have mentioned for other accounts. So I think that your account might have similar problems as other accounts you have criticized. That's the concern.
Great questions. So you basically turning the tables against me, right?
Yeah.
So the first question about the design action, I'm claiming that the outcomes of design actions are well defined. Of course, it is true, as you said, that there are different kinds of design actions, right? So I'm not saying that it's only one kind. There are many different kinds. Some of them might not be feasible for the relevant decision maker. Someone might be. And of course, as I just said, your design actions can be creating from scratch the new institution. That's unlikely. That happens rarely. Usually it's maintenance and reform existing ones, right? So you have all these at least three different kinds of design actions: creating new ones, maintaining existing one, or reforming existing ones. And of course, it's not then just deciding in the sense of creating the rules, because the rules are abstract. So how do you create them? It's rather filling the positions, making sure that people internalize the relevant rules, promoting certain ethos of the institution, and all these things, right? And of course, it depends on the decision maker what they have in power. What can they do? Sometimes they can not do more than perhaps invoking certain sanctions, let's say, and certain rules with sanctions. That's it. They can't affect people's ethos. Or if you say share a vision, no, they won't share a vision. Say trust each other, no way, because of the political situation. So in those cases, they might not have that as a feasible action, so they have to then retract and use perhaps sanctions of the more simple sort. So it all depends on the position and the context of the decision maker. What can they do? Can they actually only create and let the institution take care of itself, or can they actually go back and do maintenance work later on? And that is different for different contexts. But it's not. I don't think it shows that the outcome of design action is not well defined. It shows that what is the feasible design actions is a different question, which we discussed before. To identify the feasible design actions is a tricky one, because we then need to discuss all these issues about can they maintain the ones, how can they maintain the institutions, can they invoke sanctions, can they affect the ethos, and so on, and then all these questions have to be asked. But still, given an answer to that question, let's say you can, in fact, now invoke these rules or create this institution with these rules and have these particular sanctions or these other sanctions. Then, giving a particular design action of that kind, it's a well-defined notion what the outcome would be. Right? The second question is, of course, a very general one, namely, for any kind of discussion about act consequentialism, you need an account about what to do when you have sort of future mistakes, so to speak, when you sort of have sequences of actions that, if they were performed, would lead to great consequences, but in fact, you know that you will deviate before the end of the sequence. Right? And does that show, or does it not show, that you are obligated to perform the whole sequence, but not the first part? I mean, so some actualists, of course, would say that you can have the cake and eat it too. So you ought to perform the whole sequence, but since you would deviate if you perform the first part, you ought not to perform the first part, but then it looks like quite a strange view. And some other people, then possibilists of various kinds, have said, no. You should just focus on the maximal feasible action, and that's what's deciding what you want to do. But then you come back to the case, well, if I know that we won't actually complete the whole thing before the end of it, do we really have the obligation to do it? And to answer that question, you need to then take a stand on the actualism possibilism debate. I have some views on that, but instead of going into the details there, I think one interesting idea, which I think Douglas Portmore has been discussing, is that one should focus more on the available dispositions, not just the particular acts you can do, but quite often we can also affect the dispositions and desires and attitudes we have, which in turn will have effects on what we would do if we perform certain actions now. So he has a quite interesting discussion about less act-focused, act-consequentialism to some extent, looking at also the attitudes you are able to affect. And by affecting your attitudes, you change your dispositions, which will lead you to, perhaps, if you act in a certain way with a certain disposition, you would actually comply. Right? So it might be cases where you could affect dispositions, or the government could. So in fact, if they were to stop the whole thing, they would comply. But there are also ways to not change the dispositions. So if you were to do the first action, they would not follow through. And then they have various options in that sort of more richer sense of options. So I think that's one way to go in this debate, to think more about the attitudes and not just the particular actions here. But much more needed to be said, but they're great questions.
Any other questions?
This is probably... We'll both do it. This is going to be quick, I think. This is not very relevant to your main theme, but right at the end you have this non-utilitarian consequentialist thing. And you talk about
that.
Sorry?
You don't like that.
Well, I wanted to know more. You talked about final values.
Yeah.
You know, it's not a terminology I'm really used to. Did you mean their intrinsic values? I mean, you presumably don't think that they trump everything else, but the term final value seems to suggest that they do.
No, this is actually following, I guess, Lodek Rabinovich and others, namely that perhaps there's an issue about whether intrinsic value is the only relevant value. Why? Because intrinsic value suggests that the value only depends on intrinsic features of something. And Lodek and other people think that, well, actually sometimes something can have value in virtue of extrinsic features, but not because it's sort of a good means to an end. It's not instrumental value, but still a value in its own, for its own sake, but based on extrinsic features. So they give various examples. I think Sherlock Hagen has an example about a valuable stamp is valuable in virtue of extrinsic features, not intrinsic features necessarily. Or Lodek talks about Lady Diana's dress having a value that's sort of final because it depends on extrinsic features, and being actually owned by Diana, Princess Diana. They think that can be sort of applied as well to states of affairs. I'm actually doubtful of when it comes to that move. In fact, and Michael Zimmerman and others too, I think they might be right when it comes to objects, concrete objects, and that might be true. But I just want want to be careful here, because I know some people do think that states of affairs can have value in themselves on the basis of extrinsic features. So one example, actually, which is perhaps more in line with your own views, on some accounts of preferentialism, what has value is the object of the preference, right? And it has, it's value in its own sake, right? It's just instrumentally valuable. It's good for its own sake, in virtue of being preferred, right? And that's an extrinsic feature of the state of affairs, right? Not an intrinsic feature. So I was just being careful, and I'm not taking a stand on exactly whether they are final, if there are these sort of final non-intrinsic values. That's why I use final.
Thanks. So I was wondering whether what you thought of an additional possible tentative answer on behalf of the utilitarian consequentialist, which is more involving considerations that are specific to us as non-ideal fallible agents, where you might say something like, the problem with a lot of non-compliance might be that it would be kind of reckless, morally reckless of the agent to think that a generally reliable rule suddenly doesn't apply to them. And whereas if there are cases where it's really clear that there's a reason why they can do better than ordinarily people, we wouldn't want them to make an exception for themselves. If it's clear that you're in a special case, then it seems intuitively fine to do the utility maximizing thing, I think. And at least as far as my intuitions go, it only seems intuitively problematic if it was being kind of reckless for the agent anyway. So I wonder whether you think that's a sort of a satisfying response that the utilitarian can offer.
So it's a response to exactly which problem here?
So a response to the obvious challenge that the utilitarian makes it too easy to justify non-compliance. So say, well, it's objectively justified if it really would be better, but such an agent might well be morally reckless.
Oh, I see. Okay, so there's a distinction between sort of the act assessment and the agent assessment. So it might be the right act, but done by an agent that sort of is morally suspect because of this recklessness. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to invoke agent assessments that are not derived from act assessments. So yeah.
Any other questions? No, okay. I'd like to thank Krister once again for this very challenging presentation, actually. So now I invite you to have a drink in the lobby and enjoy yourselves at the buffet. And have a nice evening, and see you tomorrow morning at 9. Thank you.